That's the good stuff right here. Hard, soft literature. Yeah. I mean, sort of, kind of. I tell you what, I'll check it out. You know, I'm not normally one to destroy books, but so I'm just kind of big for it. Hiya folks, Fruit and Doggy here to do another book discussion, and this time I'm discussing the Coachman Rat, trying to get a good picture, show off the front cover because it actually is relevant. It has some clues. It shows, I'll probably just include an image in the actual video, but it shows an image of an anthropomorphized rat as a coachman. It shows a basically princess with shimmery dress running by in a carriage made out of a pumpkin, giant pumpkin. And basically this is a reimagined fairy tale, if you will. If you remember the Cinderella story, the Disney classic, then what happens is the fairy godmother transforms a handful of rats into horses and a coachman to drive Cinderella to the ball. But the perspective that this book takes is the perspective of that rat who is turned into a man, the coachman. You could say that the other mice, or the rats that were transformed into horses, sure, that'd be a little bit discordant, to be strange and different, but yeah, that's kind for kind, animal to animal, creature to creature, instinct to instinct. Here, though, you know, a basic rat, and then in the form of a man. And, you know, the whole question about how the magic would work, so on and so forth. But I think it's a creative premise. It's an interesting idea. Excuse me. And I thought it was an enjoyable read. With some caveats to it. Excuse me. This was written by David Henry Wilson. And this is a shorter read, just shy of 220 pages, which is a benefit. You can read it in a fairly short period of time. Which makes sense. As a reimagined fairy tale, even in novel form or a longer story form, you wouldn't expect it to be 400 or 500 pages. I mean, it could be, but maybe not. Excuse me. Now, this one doesn't have a preview like some of the other ones I've read so far, so I'm just going to read the kind of that front cover page, a little snippet of the story, which is what I read and what kind of led me to try this book out ultimately. I danced with a serving girl. We had our arms around each other and were laughing for no reason other than enjoyment. She had none of the sweet gentleness of Amedea, who isn't exactly the main character's love interest, but was a very prominent character in the story, was the Cinderella, if you will. Anyway, sorry. And none of the loving peace of the woman of light, fairy godmother, who had transformed me into a human coachman, but had an affinity with her. How can I describe it? As if we were from the same world. The music stopped briefly, and she raised her face up close to mine. Our lips met, and I closed my eyes to feel her the more intensely. Such softness, roundness, ripeness. Like this one could float into another being. The music started again, and we danced again. Go easy, Robert, called Big Jack. Take the girl's feet and take their lips, but leave them their hearts. There was more laughter, and I laughed too and held the girl even closer. I had found the world I wanted. And then the bell struck midnight. Which, again, if you're familiar with Cinderella, that has a lot of meaning. Even if you're not, you can kind of guess or predict what that might mean. But, excuse me. Looking at the positives of the book, I thought the tone, the way it was written, and you know, the dialogue, the way it built up its setting and characters, I really enjoyed it. Through the first half, it had a little bit more of a positive, not exactly fanciful, but again, it had the tone of a fairy tale where positive things were possible, where hardships might be around, but there's magic, there's ways to level the playing field so that good can fight against evil, if you will. That really wasn't too prominent in the original Cinderella, if you remember. Well, I guess I will mention at this point, with the tone of the latter half, it becomes much more sinister, cynical, and pessimistic. And in some ways, if you think about fairy tales, you might think, well, that's not really appropriate, that's not very fitting. But that's not fitting from the Disney version, especially more classic Disney. But if you look at the older fairy tales, Mother Goose, Grimm's fairy tales, the origins from which Disney got its remodeled its stories, a lot of them were very sinister, had a much more dark tone, and maybe not happily ever after to wrap things up. Or if it did, it came after a lot of suffering and misery. And quite a lot of sacrifice and loss. And this one doesn't have a conventional summary, but I am going to read a couple of the reviews and thumbs up and kudos from people who reviewed this book. It said, powerful and grim, the novel has, and I will emphasize the grim, the novel has at its heart a strong humanistic concern over man's inhumanity to man, and messages about balance, power, and hope. This is not a fairy tale for children, though I will point out the cover sort of implies that it would be. But this is not a fairy tale for children unless you want to risk them having nightmares of their own. But it is an intelligent and thought-provoking tale for adults. That's by Carolyn Cushman of Locus. And then the story has a simple, propulsive feel of a real fairy tale, but not for children. Publishers Weekly. Now, when I was first looking at this book, giving a consideration of whether I'd buy it or not, I ended up, of course, getting it. That's why I'm discussing it. I read those things since they were in lieu of a traditional preview or summary, but I guess I didn't really take that too strongly to heart. I thought, the story could manage both of those concepts, a fairy tale, but more with an adult tone, possibilities for nightmare inducing for children, but that wouldn't necessarily have to be very sinister and dark. It would have to address, evil, dark magics and forces trying to usurp the forces of good, maybe the counterpoint to the woman of light, if you will. That's coming to mind images of Wizard of Oz and the Wicked Witch of the West and so forth. But anyways, excuse me. That unfortunately isn't really how things worked out in the book. Again, this isn't an exact description, but the first half I thought had a much better tone overall, frankly. And then the latter half, and especially just the last dozen or a couple dozen pages, the ending, was just so dark, sinister, but I would even go... This is even actually I was about to say I'd go so far as to say blank, but this isn't actually any worse than sinister and dark. I was just going to say it was mean-spirited, which I think is really worse. I think it's possible to deal with a sinister situation or issue, but it struck me as mean-spirited, where even the main character, by the end of the book, they've become so dour, let me put it this way. I can understand having gone through very difficult, trying, even a tragic situation, becoming dispirited, pessimistic, down on life, depressed for a while. We all have a need for a period to grieve, but that's not really the tone that they take. They become just pessimistic, dour on life. What's the point? Who cares? To heck with it. And I think that's one reason for me that was hard to get through it by the end, because I had hoped that things would come back up. But, when the characters have really thrown in the towel and there's hopelessness, then it doesn't give me any sense of hope either. It doesn't give me anything to kind of attach to look forward to. It's like, hey, maybe there can be a bit of a positive resolution. There can be the silver linings with the cloud. It's like, nah, it's just dark, and it's going to stay dark, and it's just going to get worse. So, ultimately, I'm a bit torn on this one. I like the creativity, and I think I will admit that you could probably make a fair argument that, considering that it's just working off of the foundation of Cinderella as a concept, that maybe it's not really all that creative, or at least not original. I'd grant you that to an extent. I still thought it was interesting. I thought it was if nothing else, if you're a writer, if you enjoy working off prompts, that would be a good idea. Taking the perspective and point of view of a minor character, someone that is basically barely described, is barely there, almost a background setting, and expanding their world, going through their point of view, telling the story from the perspective of somebody who, at first glancing, was just barely worth a glance, barely worth it, tossed aside rapidly. A wallflower, perhaps. And frankly, I thought the first half was a lot more promising. I thought it was, again, engaging and interesting, and I thought that's when it was at its best. And then the second half, I thought it really just went too far. But excuse me, that's my own opinion. If you're like me, if you're a little bit more sappy, at least to the point where you enjoy a happy ending, or at least, they hit some low points, but as they hit the climax and the resolution, there's still a positivity. There's still some sense of triumph, because though there have been some losses, they gained something. They dealt with a crisis, or they grew from the experience. That to me is, it can be an ambivalent good, but that's still a good ending. But if you're not like me, though, if you don't mind a tone that's a bit more cynical or dark, if you don't mind an ending that's not more happy and sappy and positive, then this would probably fit right up your alley. I think I would consider it to be a good recommendation. I read through this pretty quickly. It wasn't a hard read. It wasn't hard to get engaged and interested in it. Excuse me. And I've lost my train of thought. I hate that. I was basically saying how I thought the book engaged well. It probably appealed to some people who just have a different perspective than me. Oh, I remember now. I was just going to say, if nothing else, with my recent discussion about Carnivore, shout out to a previous video, this book at least gives an ending, and at least wraps things up. So just keep this in mind, folks. If you lower the bar, if you have so negative an experience previously, if something does a better job, even if it's still not amazing, it'll look great by comparison. That's a good life lesson. No, I'm being a little snotty and a little snarky, and I apologize for that. Not really. I don't apologize for my tone. I'm not being hateful, at least. Just having some good fun. But anyways, overall, I think this would fit into the category of borrow it. It's not a burn it thing, you know. At the very least, I would say maybe some wasted potential, or again, my own personal preference that didn't strike the tone I like as well. But I don't think it's that bad. And if nothing else, this book is only 2 years my junior. I forgot to mention, published 1990. So maybe I have a bit of a soft spot for something of my generation. But yeah, I would say this would be a good borrow. Again, if